In these moments, as the world slows down, we invite you to embark on a leisurely and quiet journey through ancient Greek mythology, exploring those corners of history that have almost faded from human memory. These narratives unfolded amidst majestic marble columns, on well-worn, dusty roads, and by the soft glow of olive oil lamps thousands of years ago, when time itself flowed differently. Perhaps, at this very hour, the first rays of sun are illuminating the sky somewhere in Tokyo, or a quiet evening is descending upon London. Allow the day's hustle to recede, dim the surrounding lights, and perhaps put on some gentle background noise, so that nothing distracts from the immersion ahead. Now we journey back to mysterious ancient Greece, where gods walked freely among mortals, and every stone seemed to hold echoes of untold stories, awaiting their moment. Imagine waking up with such an unbearable headache that it feels like something is about to burst through your skull. That was precisely the problem Zeus, the almighty king of the gods, faced. The only difference was that, in his case, something truly did burst forth. And that something was a fully formed goddess, clad in battle armor, with a spear in hand, and a mind that would eventually become the sharpest on all of Mount Olympus. However, before delving into this astonishing moment, we should step back a little, for the beginning of this story lies not in Zeus's famous headache, but in a troubling prophecy that robbed him of his peace. Zeus, as is well known, was smitten with Metis, a titaness whose name literally meant wisdom or cunning intelligence. She possessed not only captivating beauty, but, more importantly, was incomparably smarter than anyone, including Zeus himself, though he, of course, would never admit it. Metis was not one to spend her days idly on the clouds feasting on ambrosia. On the contrary, her mind was constantly at work. She was always planning, always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. While other gods engaged in boisterous arguments, Metis calmly found an elegant solution before their angry voices had even subsided. She had a characteristic habit of tilting her head slightly when deep in thought, and her gaze would become distant, as if she saw possibilities others couldn't. Zeus was utterly captivated. He had found someone who could match his power with her intellect, someone who could help him rule more wisely. They married, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. Metis gave Zeus valuable advice on complex matters, helping him navigate the intricacies of divine governance. She did so gently, so skillfully, that Zeus often mistook her ideas for his own. Truly, it was a display of exceptional cunning. But then came the prophecy. In Greek myths, prophecies rarely bring good news, and avoiding them is almost impossible. This one was particularly ominous. It foretold that Metis would bear 2 children. First, a daughter possessing wisdom equal to Zeus's own, and then a son who would surpass his father in power and ultimately overthrow him. Zeus, of course, had ample experience with the son overthrowing father dynamic. After all, that's precisely what he had done to his own father, Cronus, who, in turn, had done the same to his father before him. It was a rather dysfunctional family tradition that Zeus was determined not to continue. And so Zeus did what at the moment seemed to him the only logical course of action, though in retrospect it was quite horrifying. He tricked Metis into transforming into a fly, and then, without hesitation, he swallowed her whole. In one moment she was there, offering wise counsel and gentle smiles. In the next, she was gone, dissolved into Zeus's divine essence. One might think that was the end of the story, but divine pregnancies unfold quite differently from those of mortals. Metis was already carrying her daughter when Zeus swallowed her, and this little goddess continued to grow inside Zeus's head, literally within his skull. For several months, Zeus suffered from increasingly severe headaches. Imagine trying to rule the heavens and earth when it feels like someone is pounding on your skull from the inside. He tried everything: divine elixirs, magic spells, even meditation, but nothing brought relief. The pain only intensified, becoming unbearable. The other gods began to notice strange changes in Zeus. He snapped at them during assemblies, lost his train of thought mid-sentence, and often stared into the distance, clutching his temples. Hera, his wife, was particularly alarmed, though she probably already suspected he was in some kind of trouble again. She was rarely wrong about such things. Her intuition was almost prophetic. Finally, when the pain became utterly intolerable, Zeus summoned Hephaestus, the god of blacksmithing and skilled crafts. Hephaestus, it must be admitted, was accustomed to unusual requests from his fellow gods, but this one was certainly strange, even by divine standards. "I need you to split my head open," Zeus said, probably not as calmly as it sounds. Hephaestus, being practical, asked the obvious questions. "Why? How? Are you absolutely sure about this?" But Zeus was beyond rational conversation. The pressure in his skull felt like it could cleave Mount Olympus itself. So Hephaestus, with a craftsman's precise care, raised his axe. It was a beautiful weapon, perfectly balanced and sharp enough to cut through divine flesh. The other gods gathered to watch, likely keeping a safe distance, just in case this daring plan went horribly wrong. The axe descended with a sound like a clap of thunder splitting the sky, and from Zeus's head emerged Athena. But here's what is often missed in dramatic retellings. She didn't just pop out and immediately start handing out strategic advice. For the first few moments she stood there, blinking in the bright Olympian light, probably as stunned as everyone else. Imagine being born fully grown. No childhood memories, no gradual learning, just sudden existence with a complete understanding of the world. She was in armor, yes, but it wasn't flashy or ornate. It was practical, perfectly fitted, the kind of protection chosen by someone who truly understood warfare. Her spear was not a ceremonial prop. It was balanced for actual combat. And her helmet, when she removed it, revealed hair already touched with the silver of wisdom, even though she was brand new to this world. The first thing she did was survey all the gods staring at her, then Zeus, who was rubbing his head with relief. She likely felt the invisible presence of her mother, Metis, somehow a part of herself, which she would spend many years understanding. "Well," she might have said in that calm, measured voice that would become so familiar to heroes and petitioners throughout the ages, "that's curious." Zeus, meanwhile, experienced the greatest relief of his immortal life. The excruciating headache was gone, replaced by a strange but profound sense of pride. Here was his daughter, obviously intelligent, undoubtedly capable, and somehow he just knew she would never be a threat to his rule. On the contrary, she would become his greatest ally. And he was right. Athena became known as Zeus's favorite child, the one he trusted above all others. She never married, never had children who might threaten the established order. Instead, she became the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and all crafts requiring both intellect and skillful hands. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between her divine duties, Athena would gently touch her temple, as if remembering something she had never truly experienced. Her mother Metis's wisdom lived within her, along with all those careful plans and quiet thoughts that had been silenced too soon. What would it be like to be born with someone else's memories, with another's wisdom flowing in your mind like a gentle stream? To carry the love and knowledge of a parent you never truly met, but who was somehow a part of you in the most literal sense. This enigma, perhaps, would forever remain a part of her greatness. The goddess Athena, whose emergence we have just witnessed, required temples built in her honor, and someone had to do the arduous work of carving and setting those massive stones. While poets composed hymns to heroes and gods, there were other hands, weathered, skilled, patient hands, that shaped the marble and limestone destined to stand for thousands of years. Many have likely seen photographs of the Parthenon, that magnificent temple crowning the Athenian Acropolis. But how many of us have considered the man who spent 3 years carving just one column capital, working with tools that today would seem incredibly primitive? His name might have been Callas or Demetrius. We will never know for sure, but his labor outlasted empires. Let us call him Alexios, for every story needs a name to live. Imagine him waking before dawn on a cool morning in 440 BCE. Roosters are just beginning to crow in the city below the Acropolis, and the olive oil lamp in his modest dwelling flickers as he gathers his tools. Alexios had been a stonemason for 23 years, learning the trade from his father, who, in turn, had learned it from his own parent. His hands were permanently stained with marble dust, and a small scar graced his left thumb, from where a chisel had slipped when he was a very young apprentice. He was 42 years old, making him experienced enough to work on the most crucial parts of the temple, yet still strong enough to handle the grueling physical demands of his craft. His morning meal was simple: slices of bread soaked in rich olive oil, a few ripe olives, and water lightly diluted with wine. His wife, Penelope, habitually handed him a packet with his midday provisions, more bread, some cheese, and, if the season allowed, a handful of succulent figs. In the early hours they exchanged few words. After 18 years of marriage, their life had settled into a comfortable and established routine that required little superfluous conversation. The walk to the majestic Acropolis took approximately 20 minutes, and Alexios was not alone on this journey. He was part of a slow stream of labourers who made the same trek daily. Carpenters carefully carrying their tools, painters hurrying with brushes and pigments, common labourers who would spend the day moving heavy marble blocks into their destined places. They exchanged silent nods of greeting. These were the people engaged in building something monumental, something destined to outlast them. All. By the time the sun began to rise over the eastern mountain peaks, the construction site was already bustling with noise and activity. The chief architect, Ictinus, as always, arrived early, meticulously checking his blueprints and verifying dimensions. His name certainly would be recorded in the annals of history. Yet Alexios possessed a knowledge that historical chronicles would likely omit. Ictinus relied heavily on the invaluable practical experience of masters like Alexios himself. Just the day before, Ictinus had consulted Alexios on a problem with a column drum. An unexpected vein had been discovered in the marble, and the architect wanted to understand how it might affect the structural integrity of the piece. Alexios ran his hands over the stone, hands that had touched thousands of marble blocks, hands capable of reading the stone as others read scrolls. "It will hold," he pronounced after a long consideration. "The grain runs with the weight, not against it. But we must orient this piece so the vein is at the back, hidden from the main line of sight." This was the kind of knowledge accumulated over decades, wisdom that came not from scrolls or complex mathematical calculations, but from years of working with stone, from a deep understanding of its character and its boundless possibilities. Today, Alexios was working on what would eventually become part of the frieze that encircled the temple's inner space. This fragment depicted a solemn procession of Athenian citizens carrying offerings to the goddess Athena during the Panathenaic festival. The specific section he had been working on for 6 weeks showed a group of young men leading cattle for sacrifice. The work progressed agonizingly slowly. Every chisel strike demanded absolute precision, for marble was unforgiving of mistakes. Too aggressive a hand could cause a piece to chip off that was meant to remain. Too delicate, and it would double the time required to complete a task that could be finished much more efficiently. Alexios began each figure by roughly shaping the main form, using a point chisel, a robust tool for removing significant amounts of stone relatively quickly. The sound it made, a tuck-tuck, became almost meditative after a while, a steady rhythm marking the passage of time. Other stonemasons working nearby created their own rhythms, and together they formed a kind of percussive ensemble, whose ringing echoes reverberated from the marble columns. As morning progressed into day and the sun climbed higher, Alexios transitioned to more refined tools. A flat chisel allowed him to smooth surfaces and create impeccable lines. Calipers helped him meticulously check proportions, the distance between a figure's eyes, the width of a bull's shoulders. The ancient Greeks had very specific ideas about ideal proportions, mathematical ratios intended to create perfect beauty. However, Alexios was well aware that mathematics alone could not create true art. There was something else, something more elusive, that distinguished merely competent carving from something truly beautiful. He saw it in how his mentor, old Sophron, could breathe life into marble, make it seem to breathe. Sophron had passed away 3 years ago, but his work was everywhere in the temple, and sometimes Alexios would pause his own work to carefully study a section carved by Sophron, striving to understand exactly how the old master achieved such striking effects. Around noon, when the sun was directly overhead, and the heat made the marble almost too hot to touch comfortably, the workers took a break. They gathered in any available shade, ate their simple meals, and shared water from large clay pitchers, which were regularly refilled by young apprentices. Conversations during these breaks rarely touched upon matters of art or architecture. More often they concerned everyday practical topics: whose wife was expecting a child, where to buy olive oil at the best price, how serious were the rumors of trouble with Sparta to genuinely worry. These men were skilled craftsmen, but they were also citizens, husbands, fathers, full members of their community. Alexios sat next to Nicias, a painter who worked on the temple's interior decorations. Nicias was younger, perhaps around 28, and still approached every aspect of the project with an enthusiasm that Alexios found both endearing and a little tiring. "Did you see the new batch of marble that arrived yesterday?" Nicias asked between bites of bread. "The quality is extraordinary, so pure you can almost see through it in thin slices." Alexios nodded. Of course he had seen it. Good marble for a stonemason was the same as good pigments for a painter, the foundation of all subsequent creation. Parian marble indeed had an exceptionally crystalline structure that allowed light to penetrate slightly beneath the surface, giving finished sculptures an almost luminous quality. "They're saving it for the cult statue," Alexios said. "Phidias wants to use it for Athena's face and hands." This was exciting news. Phidias was the most famous sculptor in all of Greece, and his statue of Athena was to be the centerpiece of the entire temple. Most of the statue would be made of gold and ivory, but the exposed skin areas, the face, hands, feet, would be carved from this precious Parian marble. After the break, Alexios returned to his section of the frieze. Afternoon work differed from the morning routine. The light had changed, now falling at a different angle, revealing aspects of the carving that had previously been hidden. It was then that he could most clearly see how the work was progressing, where adjustments were needed. He was working on the face of a young man in the procession, someone about the same age as his own son. The challenge was to create a face that looked like a specific person, someone one might encounter on the streets of Athens, yet also embodied the ideal of youthful male beauty that the Greeks so highly valued. The eyes were particularly difficult. They had to appear alert and alive, focused on the sacred duty of the procession, yet not be so specific as to distract from the overall composition. Alexios had carved hundreds of eyes over the years and had developed his own methods for creating the subtle shadows and highlights that made the marble seem to see. As he worked, he pondered permanence. This temple was being built to last forever, or as close to forever as human construction could achieve. Long after Alexios was gone, long after everyone now living in Athens was dead and forgotten, people would stand in this temple and look at the work he was doing today. It was a thought both sobering and inspiring. The face of the young man he carved would outlast wars, political upheavals, the rise and fall of empires. In a way, Alexios was achieving a kind of immortality that no king or general could claim. His work would speak for him across the centuries. But there was also something humbling in it. No one would know his name. No poet would compose songs about Alexios the stonemason. His contribution would be anonymous, absorbed into the greater glory of Athens and its patron goddess. And somehow that felt right to him. The temple was not about personal glory. It was about something larger, something that connected all Athenians to their gods and to each other. Alexios was part of that connection, one link in a chain that stretched back to the city's founding and extended forward into an unimaginable future. As the sun began to set behind the western hills, casting long shadows across the Acropolis, Alexios cleaned his tools and prepared to head home. Tomorrow he would return and continue the slow, meticulous work of bringing stone to life. Day by day, chip by chip, he and his fellow masters were creating something that would stand as a testament to human skill and unwavering devotion. What was it like for these craftsmen to spend their days creating something they knew would outlast them by thousands of years? To work in quiet anonymity on such a grand project that seemed to touch eternity itself. The artisans building Athena's temple worked up quite an appetite. and their dinner would invariably include the same golden ingredient Alexios dipped his morning bread into. Olive oil in ancient Athens was not merely food. It was life itself, flowing through the city's economy, culture, and daily rituals like blood through veins. Imagine Theodore, a skilled olive oil merchant, whose holdings included 3 fertile groves nestled on the picturesque slopes bordering ancient Athens. His awakening came long before the first rays of sun touched the horizon, driven not so much by personal ambition as by the relentless demands of his craft. For olive oil is an extraordinarily delicate product, highly sensitive to heat, light, and time, and it is these factors that often determine the fine line between prosperity and ruin in his trade. The olive trees growing on Theodore's land had witnessed many generations. Some, by tradition, were planted by his great-grandfather's grandfather. These ancient giants featured thick, gnarled trunks and silvery green foliage that rustled like whispers of antiquity with the slightest breeze. They did not reach impressive heights, olive trees rarely do, but their strength and resilience were undeniable, created by nature itself to withstand the hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters of Attica. Each tree, if one possessed the ability to read it, had its own unique character. For instance, the old tree by the stone wall invariably yielded fruit that ripened a full week earlier than the rest. The grove on the eastern slope was renowned for oil with a subtle, peppery hint, particularly prized and specifically requested by some of his regular clients. And the trees by the stream, though producing a more abundant harvest, yielded oil with a milder flavour, ideal for everyday cooking, though not as revered for special ceremonial occasions when olive oil was used in sacred religious rites. This morning, Theodore meticulously inspected the progress of the harvest. It was late October, and the olives had almost reached their ideal ripeness. They had acquired a dark purple, almost black hue, and their flesh yielded easily to pressure without falling from the branches at the slightest touch. In olive oil production, timing was absolutely crucial. Harvesting too early meant a smaller quantity of oil with a harsh, bitter taste. Delaying too long meant risking the olives beginning to ferment directly on the tree, completely spoiling the entire batch. His workers, a diverse team including slaves, hired free people, and neighbors helping in exchange for a share of the oil, had been harvesting for 3 days. They used long sticks to gently knock the olives from the branches, allowing them to fall onto large cloths, neatly spread beneath each tree. It was painstaking and delicate work. Too strong a blow could damage the buds intended for next year's crop. Too weak, and ripe olives would remain on the branches. Observing this unhurried yet intense process, one might be surprised at how much conversation occurs during an olive harvest. Olive picking is by no means a solitary activity. It required coordinated effort between the person with the stick and those holding the cloth, and this natural rhythm of labor itself created excellent opportunities for communication. Workers discussed a wide range of topics: local politics, the latest gossip from the agora, predictions about the upcoming weather, and shared complaints about their many aches and ailments. One worker, a venerable old man named Cleon, had been helping Theodore with the harvest for 15 years. He knew these trees almost as well as their owner, and had strong opinions about everything concerning olive cultivation. "This new variety they're planting in Aegina," he said, shaking his head disapprovingly as he propped a ladder against another tree. "Too much oil, but not nearly enough flavor. Quantity is far from everything." Theodore nodded absently. He had heard this opinion many times, and while he didn't entirely disagree, he also understood the economic pressures driving agricultural innovation. Athens was growing rapidly, and the demand for olive oil seemed to increase every year. Sometimes quantity did matter, especially when one had to think about feeding an entire city. By mid-morning, the workers had filled several large baskets with fresh olives, and it was time to transport them to the olive press. This was where olive oil production truly became fascinating. Although most people never considered the complex chain of processes that transformed bitter, inedible olives into the golden oil that graced their tables. The olive press was an impressive structure, a massive stone wheel that could be rolled over the olives, crushing them into a thick paste. The wheel was powered by a mule, monotonously walking in circles hour after hour, with periodic breaks for water and rest. It was not the most prestigious job, but it required utmost attention. The olives had to be thoroughly crushed, but not so aggressively that the pits cracked, which could impart an undesirable bitterness to the oil. Once the olives were properly crushed, the resulting paste was evenly spread onto round mats, skillfully woven from plant fibers. These mats were then stacked and placed under a massive wooden beam, which functioned as a lever press. Heavy weights were added to one end of the beam, creating colossal pressure that gradually squeezed the oil from the olive paste. The first oil to emerge from the press was the most valuable, clear, golden, with an astonishingly fresh, fruity aroma, speaking eloquently of sunlight and meticulous cultivation. This first pressing, which today we might call extra virgin olive oil, was in the highest demand and commanded the highest price in the agora. Wealthy Athenians used it for exquisite dishes, and it was absolutely indispensable for religious ceremonies where purity was paramount. But the process didn't end there. After the first pressing, the mats were rearranged and pressed again, yielding a second grade of oil, still good enough for most culinary purposes. Even after that, the remaining paste could be mixed with hot water and pressed one more time, producing a lower grade oil perfectly suitable for use in lamps and other non-culinary purposes. Theodore was proud that nothing went to waste in his production. The remaining pulp and pits served as excellent fertilizer for the next year's crop. The water used in the final pressing, though unfit for drinking, could be used to irrigate the olive trees during droughts. Even the mats, when they finally wore out, were composted and returned to the soil, enriching the land. On this day, Theodore intended to load amphorae, those distinctive clay vessels with narrow necks and pointed bottoms, with his finest oil and transport them to Athens for sale. The amphorae themselves were true works of art, crafted by skilled potters who understood that the vessel was almost as important as its contents. A well-made amphora protected the oil from light and air, preserving its freshness for many months, or even years. The journey to the city took about 2 hours by ox cart, along a road that had been worn smooth by generations of similar trips. Theodore knew every stone and rut on that path, every spot where the cart might get stuck in wet weather, every vista that opened up to a panorama of the city and its surroundings. As they approached Athens, the traffic grew busier. Other farmers brought their produce to market: wheat, barley, wine, honey, cheese, vegetables. The city depended entirely on this daily flow of food from the surrounding countryside and the hut. Farmers, in turn, depended on the city's appetite for their goods. It was a relationship that functioned flawlessly, as both sides needed what the other offered. Theodore's permanent spot in the agora was near the southwest corner, where he had sold his oil for 12 years. His customers knew exactly where to find him, and he, in turn, was aware of their preferences. Aristophanes the cook always wanted the peppery oil from the eastern slope grove. The priestess of Demeter insisted on oil from the oldest trees, claiming she could taste the difference in ritual preparations. But today he had a new customer, a young woman who seemed not entirely sure what she was looking for. Perhaps she was recently married and just learning to run a household. Theodore patiently explained the different grades of oil, letting her sample small amounts directly from his finger. "For cooking fish," he said, "you'll want something with a little bite, something that won't get lost among stronger flavors. But for bread, or for dressing vegetables, you might prefer something softer, more subtle." This kind of education was part of his job, and he genuinely enjoyed it. There was something deeply satisfying about helping someone understand something you knew well, in sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of olive growers and oil makers. By the end of the day, most of his amphorae were empty, sold to buyers who carried the oil home in smaller containers. The money he earned would go to pay for what his farm could not produce itself: salt, iron, tools, pottery, cloth. It also provided a small surplus that allowed him to gradually improve his groves, planting new trees to replace those that had finally grown too old to bear good fruit. As he loaded the empty vessels back onto the cart for the return journey, Theodore reflected on the strange miracle of his craft. These ancient trees, planted by ancestors he had never known, continued to provide sustenance for families he might never meet. The oil that flowed from his presses would light lamps in homes throughout Athens, nourish children yet unborn, anoint athletes preparing for contests, and serve as offerings in temples dedicated to gods whose stories stretched back to the very beginning of human memory. There was something deeply satisfying about participating in this ancient, unbroken cycle: planting, tending, harvesting, processing, selling, and then starting all over again. The olive trees would outlast him, as they had outlasted his father and grandfather. The knowledge of how to transform bitter fruit into golden oil would pass to his sons and their sons after them. It was an existence deeply rooted in the earth and in human tradition, where daily labor connected a man to millennia of accumulated wisdom. The olive oil Theodore had just sold would soon find its way to many tables across Athens, including the one where Philip, a valiant hoplite in the Athenian army, would share his evening meal with his family. However, at this very moment, as dawn broke over the mountains, Philip was 40 miles from home, carrying 60 pounds of gear and wondering when his aching feet would finally stop complaining. The image of a hoplite, celebrated by poets, seems filled with romance and glory. Brave warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their bronze armor gleaming under the sun, fighting for the greatness of Athens. The reality, however, is significantly different from these elevated notions. Most of a hoplite's time is spent on grueling marches, and Philip had covered a good deal of ground lately. His unit had left Athens 6 days ago, responding to reports of raiders threatening one of the city's allied settlements. As it turned out, the alarm was false. The supposed raiders were merely a group of shepherds who had, in following their flocks, wandered much farther from home than usual. But an order is an order, and the army does not turn back simply because a threat proves illusory. They continued their march to a frontier fortress, where they were to spend 2 weeks assisting with repairs to the fortifications and training the local militia. Philip was 31 years old, making him one of the middle-aged members of his unit. He had dedicated 13 years of his life to serving as a hoplite. Since inheriting enough land to afford the necessary equipment, military service in Athens had become both a sacred duty and an honourable privilege for him. Only sufficiently wealthy citizens, capable of purchasing their own armour and weapons, were called to serve in the heavy infantry. His panoply, a full set of hoplite gear, represented a significant investment. The bronze cuirass alone cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in 3 months. The round shield, or hoplon, from which the hoplites derived their name, was made of wood covered in bronze, with a distinctive rim that could be used as a weapon in close combat. The 9-foot spear was perfectly balanced for thrusting, not throwing. A short sword served as a backup weapon, and a bronze helmet with a characteristic crest completed this formidable ensemble. All this equipment was tightly strapped to Philip's body, or slung over his shoulders as he steadily walked along the dusty road. The weight was distributed as evenly as possible, but after 6 days of marching, every strap had found a way to chafe his skin, and every piece of metal seemed to have developed its own method of digging into his flesh. The morning was still cool, which was a true blessing. By midday, when the sun would be at its zenith, the bronze armour would become almost unbearably hot. Philip had long learned to drink water regularly throughout the day, even when he wasn't particularly thirsty, as dehydration in armour could be extremely dangerous. He walked beside Nicodemus, a potter who served in the same unit. For years they had marched together on various campaigns, and they had developed the kind of easy, unforced conversation that helped pass the long hours on the road. "My wife," Nicodemus said, adjusting his shield strap for the 100th time that morning, "thinks I should ask for a garrison assignment in the city. Easier on the family, she says. A more predictable schedule." Philip thoughtfully considered the suggestion. Garrison duty indeed had its undeniable advantages. Most nights you slept in your own bed. You could attend to personal affairs. Children grew up knowing who you were, but it also tended to be mind-numbingly boring. Standing guard at the city gates, escorting officials to meetings, maintaining equipment that was rarely used in actual combat. The pay is about the same, Philip pointed out, but you miss out on your share of any spoils we might capture. This was an important consideration for citizen soldiers who did not possess great wealth. Military service was paid, but not generously, and the prospect of additional income from successful campaigns could significantly impact a family's economic well-being. The column of marching hoplites stretched for almost a quarter-mile along the road. Approximately 400 men were on this expedition, organized into units by their file and dem. Philip belonged to the Antiochus Phyle, and within it, he was part of a group from his local deme of Achani. These were men he had known most of his life, neighbours, relatives, people he saw regularly in the agora or at religious festivals. This familiarity was both a strength and a complication. On one hand, hoplite warfare relied on mutual trust and coordination. When you stood in a phalanx, your life literally depended on the man next to you, maintaining his position and doing his job. It helped to know that the man holding the shield that protected your right side was someone you had grown up with, whose character you understood. On the other hand, personal relationships could complicate military discipline. The man marching in front of Philip was his cousin Demetrius, who had a tendency to complain loudly about everything from the quality of their rations to the competence of their officers. In civilian life, this was just part of Demetrius's character, something his family tolerated with good-natured eye rolls. In military situations, it could be genuinely disruptive to morale. Around mid-morning, the column reached a small stream, where they were allowed a short rest. The men dropped their heavy packs and immediately headed for the water, not only to quench their thirst, but also to splash their hot faces and necks. Some of the younger soldiers completely removed their bronze cuirasses, but veterans like Philip knew that the effort to put the armor back on was not worth the temporary relief. Instead, he found a shady spot under an olive tree and carefully sat down, mindful of the sword at his hip and the spear he leaned against the trunk. From his pack, he pulled out a piece of stale bread and some dried figs, standard campaign rations, nourishing if not particularly exciting. As he ate, Philip watched the younger men splashing in the stream and recalled his own first campaign 15 years ago. He had been so full of a desire to prove himself, so convinced that military service would be all glory and heroism, that the reality of sore feet, heavy gear, and endless walking had come as a significant shock. But over the years, he had developed a different attitude toward military service. There was something about the straightforwardness of army life. You knew what was expected of you. Your duties were clearly defined. Success and failure were usually obvious. In his civilian life, Philip farmed the land left to him by his father, growing olives and barley and keeping a few goats. It was good work, honest work, but it was also full of uncertainties. The weather, plant diseases, fluctuating market prices, the need to maintain good relations with neighbors who might help in emergencies. All these factors could affect his family's well-being in ways largely beyond his control. Military service, by contrast, reduced his life to simpler terms. Follow orders, care for your equipment, look out for your fellow soldiers, perform your duty when called to battle. There was something almost comforting in that clarity. The rest period ended too quickly, as it always did, and the column reformed to continue the march. The road ahead gradually climbed into hills covered with scrub oak and wild grasses. The landscape was beautiful in its own way, rocky, sun-baked, dotted with small farms and shepherds' huts, but Philip had learned to see it primarily in terms of tactical considerations. That ridge would provide good cover for archers. The narrow pass ahead could be easily blocked by a small force, trapping a larger army in the valley below. The flat ground near that village would be good for forming a phalanx, but the rocky ground to the east would favor lighter, more mobile troops. This way of looking at the landscape developed gradually in experienced soldiers. Everything became a potential battlefield, every natural feature a possible advantage or obstacle. It was not an especially peaceful way to see the world, but it was practical knowledge that had kept Philip alive in several real battles. By late afternoon, the fortress they were heading for became visible in the distance. It was a modest cluster of stone buildings, surrounded by walls that had clearly seen better days. This was what they would be working on for the next 2 weeks, as well as training the local militia in basic tactics and formations. It was not glamorous work, but it was vitally important. The network of small fortresses and allied settlements surrounding Athens was an integral part of what kept the city safe and prosperous. Each outpost extended Athenian influence slightly, served as a base for patrols that kept trade routes secure, and offered refuge to farmers and shepherds when raiders appeared. As they approached the outpost, Philip watched the locals hasten to meet them. The garrison commander, local officials and groups of children filled with awe and curiosity at the sight of real Athenian warriors moved toward them. A short ceremony would take place, accompanied by solemn speeches about civic duty and devotion to the polis, followed by the meticulous work of setting up camp and immediately commencing their assigned tasks. This evening he would spend the night under the open sky, wrapped in his cloak, with his shield as a humble pillow. This state of affairs, though devoid of comforts, was familiar to him, and in it lay a simple yet profound satisfaction that comes from shedding heavy armour and giving tired feet much-needed rest. Tomorrow he would wake with aching muscles in previously unknown places and set about strengthening this small outpost, symbolizing Athenian power. This would not become a story for heroic tales, but it was precisely such tireless, unglamorous labours that ensured the stable functioning and inviolability of the entire city-state. It was hard not to ponder the burden a warrior had to bear, both physical and metaphorical, the colossal weight of armour and weapons, and the responsibility for protecting not only his own family, but the entire community that relied entirely on his service. While Philip and his comrades marched to their remote frontier fort, pilgrims from all corners of the Hellenic world undertook their own, entirely different journey to an incomparably more celebrated and mysterious sanctuary, Delphi, where the oracle's voice was considered a direct relay of Apollo's words. However, behind the lavish dramatic prophecies and strict sacred rituals lay a much more mundane and quiet story of everyday life, unfolding in the sacred shadow of the gods. Before us stands the Pythia, not her personal name, which was probably quite ordinary, say Cleone or Theodora, but the honorary title she adopted upon becoming the living voice of the great oracle. She was 43 years old and had dedicated 11 of those years to serving as Pythia, and at this moment she was secluded in her modest room within the temple complex, meticulously preparing for what might be one of the most significant consultations of her long career. Tomorrow, envoys from Athens were expected to arrive with questions concerning a proposed large-scale military campaign. The following day, a delegation from Sparta would seek divine guidance on a disputed succession to the throne, and the week after, a wealthy Corinthian merchant would arrive to inquire whether Apollo favoured his ambitious plan to establish a new trading colony. The stream of questions was endless, and each carried the immense weight of decisions capable of determining the fates of thousands. But this evening, in the silent hour before dawn, the Pythia was merely an ordinary middle-aged woman, her hair touched with grey, her eyes betraying fatigue, preparing herself, both morally and spiritually, for another day when she would become the earthly voice of a deity. Her daily routine began with scrupulous purification rituals that remained unseen by most pilgrims visiting Delphi. She immersed herself in the waters of the sacred Castalian spring, whose chilling coolness made her involuntarily gasp even in the height of summer. This sharp temperature shock from the icy water was an integral part of her preparation. It served to clear her mind, focusing her consciousness and fully rooting her in her own body, making her receptive to any divine inspiration that might descend. After bathing, she donned a simple white chiton, a garment symbolizing her sacred service. No ornaments, no extravagances, nothing that could distract or hinder her purpose of being a pure and unclouded conduit for Apollo's wisdom. Her morning meal was also extremely simple: bread, water, perhaps a few almonds. She had long since found that divine prophecy manifested more easily when the stomach was nearly empty. The oracle's sanctuary itself was a place unlike any other on earth. Built directly over a natural fissure in the bedrock, its air was filled with the persistent scent of laurel leaves and the faint, sweet smell of mysterious gases rising from the deepest underground layers. Modern researchers propose various theories regarding the nature of these gases, perhaps ethylene or other natural chemical compounds capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. For the Pythia, however, there was no category of chemical substances. For her, the unusual sensations she experienced in that chamber were nothing less than the direct presence of the deity. Her faithful assistant, the priest Nicomachus, was already awaiting her arrival at the temple. He was a priest who had dedicated 23 years of his life to Delphi, and his primary role was to serve as a liaison and interpreter between the oracle and the outside world. The Pythia uttered the words imparted to her by Apollo, yet these pronouncements were not always easily comprehensible to mere mortals. Sometimes her lips spoke verses, sometimes obscure riddles, and occasionally words in languages she had never consciously studied. Over years of service, Nicomachus had developed an outstanding skill in interpreting divine pronouncements, transforming them into understandable and practically applicable advice. This was an extremely delicate and responsible task. He had to remain absolutely faithful to the oracle's words while making them accessible to those who had travelled hundreds of miles and sacrificed significant resources for the high privilege of seeking Apollo's counsel. The Athenian delegation arrived late last night, he informed her, as they moved together through the winding temple corridors. It includes 3 distinguished generals and 1 representative from the Athenian assembly. Their question concerns the proposed expedition to Sicily. The Pythia nodded silently. She had anticipated this consultation. The planned Sicilian expedition had long been a subject of lively discussion and rumour throughout the Hellenic world. It was an extremely ambitious undertaking, capable of bringing unheard-of glory and fabulous wealth to Athens, or of ending in crushing and utter disaster. Such decisions, as a rule, mortal rulers preferred not to make without direct divine guidance. When they finally arrived, the consultation chamber was already meticulously prepared. The sacred tripod, a 3-legged bronze seat, stood directly over the rock fissure. Laurel branches, Apollo's sacred plant, were neatly arranged throughout the room. An unquenchable fire glowed steadily in its bronze brazier, as it had for countless centuries. The Pythia took her seat on the tripod, closed her eyes, allowing her breathing to slow and deepen. This was the most mysterious and incomprehensible part of her service, the moment when she had to somehow open herself, to become a pure vessel for divine communication. After 11 years of practice, she had developed certain methods that certainly helped, but the process was never exactly the same twice. Sometimes inspiration came in the form of clear words that seemed to arise in her mind, without any conscious effort on her part. Sometimes it was more like streams of images or strong emotions that she had to somehow put into words. And sometimes, and this happened more often than she cared to admit, nothing happened at all, and she was left to sit patiently in silence, waiting for Apollo to deign to speak, or until it became clear that this day was not meant for prophecy. At the head of the Athenian delegation was Nicias, a general whom she remembered well from previous consultations with the oracle. He was known as a thoughtful and deeply religious man, who rarely made momentous decisions without first securing divine guidance. His questions were always deeply considered, and he listened with unwavering reverence to every answer he received. Today, however, there was something different in his demeanour, a certain inner tension that suggested he already anticipated or feared what the oracle might reveal. When Nicomachus formally posed the question regarding the Sicilian expedition, the Pythia sensed that Nicias secretly hoped for an unequivocally negative answer, some divine permission to abandon a plan that he himself considered extremely dangerous. The inspiration, when it finally descended, was unusually clear and instantaneous. Words, as if carved from the ether, formed in the Pythia's mind, and she spoke them aloud, not fully grasping their profound meaning. The expedition will bring great changes to Athens. Many will sail who will not return. The gods favor those who act justly, but justice and victory are not always the same. This was precisely the type of answer that petitioners to the oracle both valued and hated. It clearly addressed their question, yet allowed for countless interpretations. Did it mean the expedition had the gods' blessing, or was it an unequivocal warning against it? Such ambiguity, though frustrating, was also profoundly honest. The future rarely appears as clear and unambiguous as mortals would wish. Nicomachus meticulously recorded the oracle's words, after which the Athenian delegation withdrew to thoughtfully discuss their profound meaning. This was another important aspect of consulting the oracle that petitioners could not always foresee, for the interpretation of the prophecy often proved as, if not more, significant than the divine prediction itself. In between consultations, the Pythia found solace in a small, secluded garden located behind the temple. It was a peaceful sanctuary, sheltered by the shade of ancient olive trees and filled with the soothing hum of bees, diligently collecting nectar among lavender and rosemary bushes. These moments of silence and solitude were vital for maintaining her mental balance in a job that required her constant openness and accessibility to the divine world. She had served as Pythia long enough to witness the far-reaching consequences of some of her prophecies. Entire cities waged wars, or, conversely, refrained from them, based on her words. Individuals made life-altering decisions thanks to guidance received in the oracle's sacred chamber. The burden of such colossal responsibility was sometimes unbearable. However, there were also moments of genuine wonder, when she felt clearly connected to something incomparably greater than herself. Not every prophecy was the result of dramatic and sudden inspiration. Many consultations concerned straightforward requests for guidance on mundane life problems, and the answers that came through her were often surprisingly practical and very helpful. A farmer wanted to know the best time to sow his crops. A woman inquired whether she should accept a marriage proposal. A merchant sought advice on the safest route for his trading voyage. These consultations might not have made history in the grand sense, but they constantly reminded the Pythia that her true role was ultimately to help people lead wiser and more meaningful lives. As the day slowly drew to a close, she received visitors from Thebes, Corinth, and even from a small but significant city-state located in southern Italy. Each consultation unfolded according to a long-established pattern. It began with a formal statement of the question, followed by a period of inspired, sometimes enigmatic response, after which her words were carefully recorded, and finally, a discussion of their meaning and possible interpretations ensued. However, beneath this strict ritual structure lay a much deeper human drama. Here gathered people facing true, sometimes frightening, uncertainty, desperately seeking guidance in situations where the stakes were extraordinarily high. Over time, the Pythia learned to perceive not only their spoken questions, but also the deep fears and hopes hidden in their hearts. A young man from Corinth, for example, sought advice on a business venture, but his true, secret concern was whether he was worthy of his father's respect. An elderly woman from Thebes asked about her grandson's education, but what truly troubled her was whether her family line would continue to prosper after her passing. By evening, when the last consultation was complete and the temple complex descended into the encroaching silence, the Pythia felt an exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. Speaking on behalf of a god, even for just a few hours a day, required an emotional and spiritual energy that is exceedingly difficult to describe to those who have never experienced it. She dined alone in her modest quarters. Simple bread, cheese, olives, and water mixed with a small amount of wine. The food seemed especially delicious after a day of fasting and intense spiritual effort. As she ate, she heard the muffled, distant sounds of pilgrims gathering around their campfires, discussing the guidance they had received and making plans for their return journey. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new seekers, new opportunities to serve as a bridge between the world of humans and the divine world. This work would continue, as it had for many centuries, as long as people needed guidance and Apollo chose to provide it through mortal voices. What would it be like to spend your days translating the whispers of the gods into words that ordinary people could understand and use? To bear such immense responsibility for the most important decisions of others. The pilgrims gathering around their campfires in Delphi would be hungry the next morning, and their breakfast would depend on the tireless labor of men like Dionysius, a farmer whose fields stretched across the fertile plain of Thessaly. His life unfolded far from the famous temples and bustling agoras that typically draw our attention when we reflect on ancient Greece. Dionysius grew wheat and barley on land his family had worked for 6 generations. He was 54 years old, and his hands were permanently marked by labor, imbued with soil and sun. He possessed a deep knowledge of weather patterns and soil conditions that no book learning could provide. Right now, on this cool, early spring morning, he walked his fields with the focused attention of a man whose survival and his family's well-being depended on making absolutely correct decisions about when, how much, and precisely where to plant. The past winter had been mild, which was generally considered good news for farming, yet Dionysius had learned to be cautious about drawing conclusions too quickly. A mild winter could portend an early spring, which sounded positive, but it also meant that some pests, normally killed off by hard frosts, might have survived the cold. And early planting, while potentially leading to more abundant harvests, also increased the risk of crop damage if late frosts struck after the seeds had already sprouted. He stopped at the edge of his largest field, knelt, and scooped up a handful of earth. It was an action he performed almost unconsciously, testing the soil with his fingers, feeling for the right balance of moisture and texture that indicated optimal planting conditions. Too wet, and the seeds would rot before germinating. Too dry, and they wouldn't sprout at all. Today the soil seemed adequate, though not perfect. Perfect soil was something that existed more in hope than in reality, but this was perfectly acceptable for the work that lay ahead. Dionysius straightened up and called to his son Callisthenes, who was preparing the ox-drawn plough at the far end of the field. Callisthenes was 22, strong from years of farm labor, and eager to take on more responsibility for the family's affairs. However, he was young enough to sometimes question old farming methods, which led to interesting conversations during the long hours they spent working together. "Father," he said, guiding the plough into position, "I spoke with Aristodemus yesterday. He plans to try a new planting method we heard about from the Egyptians, denser planting, more intensive cultivation. He thinks it could increase yields by up to 20%. Dionysius considered this, checking the plough's bronze share, ensuring it was properly sharpened and securely attached. He had heard about the Egyptian methods and they did sound promising in theory. But theory and practice were different things, especially when dealing with something as unpredictable as farming. Aristodemus has good land, he finally said. Rich soil, a reliable water source, enough slaves to do the extra work that intensive cultivation requires. Our situation is different. This was part of the ongoing education every farmer had to pass to the next generation. Not just the technical knowledge of how to grow crops, but the wisdom to understand what would and would not work in their specific circumstances. Every farm differed, shaped by unique combinations of soil, climate, water availability, labor, and market conditions. They began ploughing, following the furrows that stretched the length of the field. The work was rhythmic, almost meditative, once they settled into the right pace. The ox knew what it needed to do and rarely needed guidance. Callisthenes walked beside the animal, occasionally adjusting its direction to keep the furrows straight. Dionysius followed behind, using a short hoe to break up clods of earth and level the bottom of the furrow. As they worked, Dionysius watched the sky with the automatic vigilance of a man whose existence depended on the whims of the weather. The clouds today were high and thin, likely no rain, which was good for ploughing, but meant they would need to keep a close eye on soil moisture over the next few days. Too many clear days in a row, and the ground would become too hard for planting. The rhythm of the work created natural opportunities for conversation, and father and son spoke of many things as they traversed the field. Family news. Callisthenes' younger sister was getting married next month, and preparations needed to be made. Local politics. The city assembly was debating a new tax on grain exports, which could affect their income. Technical farming questions. Whether to expand the area dedicated to wheat or plant more barley instead. Each of these conversations reflected the complex web of relationships and considerations that shaped a farmer's life. A marriage required careful planning because the harvest season was approaching, and they needed all available labor during those critical weeks. The tax debate was important because Dionysius sold some of his crop to merchants who exported grain to other cities. The choice between wheat and barley involved balancing market prices, soil conditions, water needs, and family preferences. By midday, they had ploughed about half the field. It was good progress, but the work was far from done. They rested in the shade of an old oak at the field's edge, sharing bread, cheese, and water from a clay jug Callisthenes' mother had packed for them that morning. As they ate, Dionysius pointed out landmarks and features of their land that told the story of many years of careful cultivation. See that small rise there? The drainage is better in that section. That's why we always plant our earliest wheat there. And that low-lying section by the stream, it stays wetter longer, making it ideal for barley. This deep knowledge of the land developed over decades. Every slope, every drainage pattern, every change in soil quality represented information that influenced planting decisions. A good farmer learned to read his land as a scholar reads scrolls, seeing patterns and opportunities that were not obvious to outsiders. After noon, the weather changed. Clouds were gathering from the west, portending possible rain later in the day. This presented a small dilemma. Rain would be good for the soil, softening it and making the work easier. But rain would also delay planting, and the calendar was already getting tight for optimal spring planting. Dionysius decided to finish ploughing this field today, even if it meant working a little longer than usual. It was the kind of decision farmers made dozens of times each season, balancing multiple factors, trying to optimize outcomes while acknowledging that much of what happened was beyond their control. As they resumed their tasks, Callisthenes asked a question that young men have probably posed to their farmer parents for millennia. Do you think I should stay on the farm or try something else? Perhaps move to the city, learn a craft? It was a perfectly valid inquiry. Farming, as is well known, is arduous work, whose fruits are not always guaranteed. City life, in contrast, offers different prospects. Mastering specialized crafts, opportunities for trade, active participation in civic and political life, and a wealth of cultural events. Moreover, there was no absolute certainty that the family farm could provide a decent living for the next generation at the same level of prosperity Dionysius had maintained. However, farm life also held undeniable advantages, a deep sense of satisfaction stemming from cultivating food that nourished people, an unbreakable connection to the fertile soil, the changing seasons and nature's eternal cycles, and the self-sufficiency and autonomy that came with being able to produce almost everything necessary to sustain the family. The city needs what we grow here, Dionysius said, after a brief pause for reflection, and we need what the city produces: tools, pottery, cloth, bronze. One way of life is unthinkable without the other. While not a direct answer to Callisthenes' question, it was a valuable perspective, worthy of deep consideration. The interaction between the countryside and urban centres was not one of rivalry, but of harmonious complementarity. The grain Dionysius grew nourished the artisans who crafted the very tools he used in his labour. The taxes he paid supported the warriors who protected his lands. The surplus produce he sold at market allowed him to acquire city goods intended to make his family's life more comfortable and prosperous. As dusk settled, the vast field was fully ploughed, prepared for the upcoming sowing. Tomorrow, if weather conditions were favourable, they would embark on the meticulous and laborious task of planting the seeds. Moving along the freshly ploughed furrows, they would manually scatter the grain at a measured pace, designed to ensure maximum germination and a subsequent bountiful harvest. As they cleaned and tidied their farming implements, Dionysius reflected on a day successfully spent preparing for the coming year's crop. A farmer's work, it seemed, was endless. There was always something requiring close attention, some aspect of the farm's operation to be improved, or a new task demanding immediate action. However, in this eternal union between human diligence and nature's bounty lay a profound satisfaction. The golden wheat and sturdy barley that would sprout in this field would be transformed into bread, feeding cities across the vast Greek world. These grains would sustain families, form the foundation for communities, ensuring the existence of a complex civilization that produced art, philosophy, and dramatic works. This entire grand process began here, from fertile soil and tiny seeds, through the patient labour of people who had mastered the art of coaxing sustenance from the earth. What was it like to be engaged in a pursuit so fundamental that the fate of entire civilizations depended on its success, yet so unnoticed that history rarely preserves the names of its practitioners? The harvest gathered from Dionysius's fields would eventually cross the borders of Greece on ships, whose movement was powered by the efforts of men like Lysander, who had served as a rower in the Athenian fleet for 4 years. At this very moment, At dawn on a serene morning illuminating the Aegean Sea, he was among 170 rowers, seated on wooden benches aboard a trireme, awaiting the signal that heralded the start of another day of grueling training. Lysander, 26 years old, hailed from a humble fishing village on the coast of Attica. His entry into the fleet was driven not by a fervent desire for adventure or a thirst for military glory, but by pragmatic calculation. Service here offered higher remuneration than a fisherman's labour, and it opened avenues for career advancement utterly unthinkable in his native settlement. Naval service, however, proved more engaging than he had initially anticipated, though immeasurably more demanding physically and morally. The vessel on which Lysander served was named the Millennia, and was a true embodiment of engineering genius and shipbuilding artistry. It was 120 feet long and designed for maximum speed and exceptional maneuverability, not for carrying bulky cargo. Its sleek and narrow hull was skillfully carved to cut through the water with minimal resistance when propelled by the synchronized efforts of numerous oars. Above the deck designated for rowers was space for marines and officers, where their weapons and equipment were stored. However, the true heart of the vessel beat here, in the rowing compartment, where men like Lysander generated the propulsion that made everything else possible. Lysander occupied a seat on the middle tier of rowers. It was not the most prestigious assignment, but neither was it the most grueling. The top-tier rowers, known as Thranites, received slightly higher pay because their oars were longer and required greater skill to manage. Those on the bottom tier, Thalamites, worked in more cramped conditions and were constantly sprayed by seawater when the ship gained high speed. Lysander's oar was about 13 feet long, its blade carefully shaped and balanced for maximum efficiency. After 4 years of continuous daily practice, he knew perfectly what the oar should feel like in his hands. He was familiar with the distribution of weight, the resistance encountered when submerged in water, and the subtle vibrations that unerringly told him how perfectly synchronized he was with the other rowers. Lysander's benchmate was Proclus, a veteran of 7 years of naval service, who had become a sort of mentor to younger rowers over the years in the fleet. Proclus had experience in actual battles, facing Spartan ships in border skirmishes, and his stories gave the rest of the crew the most vivid insight into the true nature of naval warfare. What people often don't understand about naval combat, Proclus remarked yesterday during a short break, is the decisive role of rowing. All the world's most perfect weapons will be useless if you can't maneuver the ship into an optimal position, and that positioning depends entirely on us, the rowers. This was what Lysander gradually realized during his time in the fleet. From the outside, a trireme might seem like a warship coincidentally equipped with oars for propulsion, but from the inside it was far more accurately perceived as a high-precision rowing machine that merely happened to carry weaponry. All other elements, be it the bronze ram at the bow, the marines with their spears and shields, or the tactical genius of the officers, made sense only when the rowers could deliver the ship precisely where it needed to be, at the strictly determined moment. The morning training sessions were dedicated to practicing the complex maneuvers that made trireme combat so demanding. They would refine the diek plows, a technique where the ship aimed to break through the enemy's formation and ram it from the side. They would also practice the periplus, an outflanking maneuver requiring flawless coordination of several ships. And of course they would practice the basic but critically important skill of rapid retreat to evade enemy ramming attacks. The Keleustes, The rowing master, responsible for maintaining rhythm and giving commands, signaled the start of training. Oars, his authoritative cry rang out, and 170 blades simultaneously struck the water. The sound was distinct and incomparable, impossible to get used to. It was the splash of submerging blades, the creak of oar handles sliding on leather supports, and the rhythmic grunt of the rowers, erupting from immense effort. "Ready, pull!" The next command followed immediately, and the vessel sprang into motion. The ship smoothly gained speed, for all these disparate efforts converged, creating powerful forward momentum. Lysander felt the familiar burning in his shoulders and back as his body adjusted to the collective rhythm. Rowing a trireme was significantly different from the effort required to manage a small boat. The water resistance was colossal, and maintaining combat speed demanded tireless effort from every crew member. However, there was also deep satisfaction in this labor. When everything worked in harmony, when every rower acted in perfect synchronization, the ship seemed to glide over the water with an almost supernatural grace. One could feel the hull lift slightly as it gained speed, cutting through the waves with minimal resistance. It was in such moments that Lysander understood why some men dedicated their entire lives to naval service. The first morning exercises focused on practicing rapid stops and instantaneous starts. These sudden changes in movement could decide the outcome of a real battle, separating victory from defeat. "Oars on board," the Kelustas commanded, and immediately all rowers lifted their blades from the water, holding them horizontally. The ship continued to glide forward by inertia, but without the propulsion of the oars, its speed began to steadily decrease. "Back!" The next command followed without delay, and now all oars plunged back into the water, but pulling in the opposite direction. This was one of the most physically exhausting actions a trireme crew was capable of. The rowers not only overcame the inertia of the massive vessel, but also battled the natural resistance of the water. Lysander gritted his teeth and strained at his oar, feeling the ship tremble, resisting its own motion. In just a few moments, the millennia came to a complete stop. A couple more seconds and it was actually beginning to move backward. It was an impressive demonstration of what human strength, when properly organized and purposefully directed, could achieve. In between exercises, during short breaks, the rowers exchanged quiet remarks. Their conversations were a curious mix of technical jargon, sharing personal news, and speculating about where their next assignment might take them. Some had heard rumors of an upcoming escort for a grain convoy from Egypt, while others suspected they would participate in a demonstration of naval power in the waters near Corinth. Lysander found these conversations surprisingly comforting. These men came from all corners of Attica and beyond. Among them were fishermen, farmers, artisans, laborers. Yet naval service forged an unbreakable common bond between them. They were united by the same daily rituals, similar physical challenges, and a shared pride in mastering a complex and vitally important skill. The diversity of their backgrounds, in fact, subtly but effectively strengthened team spirit. Proclus, thanks to years spent fishing, possessed deep knowledge of weather conditions. Darren, 2 benches ahead, had worked as a carpenter before joining the fleet and had valuable insights into wood and its proper care. Hippers, who grew up on a farm, possessed the incredible stamina developed through years of heavy agricultural labor. As noon approached, the crews began practicing the most intriguing and complex maneuver in their arsenal, a coordinated assault requiring flawless interaction between 3 ships. In this exercise, the Salaminia and 2 other triremes were to simultaneously converge on an imaginary enemy vessel, attacking it from several different directions. Such tactics forced the enemy to concentrate attention on one threat, thereby leaving it vulnerable to attack from other sides. This tactical synergy required not only the highest skill from each individual crew, but also impeccable communication and precise synchronization between all participating vessels. Flag signals, clear trumpet calls, and accurate, pre-rehearsed execution of movements. All these elements had to work as a single, perfect mechanism. When everything went perfectly, the spectacle resembled watching a meticulously choreographed dance performed by ships, each weighing at least 40 tons. However, when something went wrong, as inevitably happened during their second attempt that morning, ships could come dangerously close to each other. Oars could become entangled, and the entire orderly formation risked dissolving into chaos and confusion. This served as a sobering reminder of how much effort and practice was required to truly master the art of trireme combat. But they tirelessly continued to work at it, repeating the same maneuver again and again, until coordination became an absolutely instinctive skill for them. This is the true essence of naval training. It is not simply about building physical endurance and strength, although these aspects are certainly important.